Welcome back to another episode of Remember the Great Sports. Today we're going to focus on the Charlotte Hornets all-time team. This is an NBA 2K18 video. NBA 2K19 is out, so you can use some of these suggestions for your lineup for NBA 2K19 as well. They're not completely identical, but they're very similar, and this is a good starting point for you if you want to make those roster edits. And again, this is my honest opinion of how I like to make my team. You have the discretion to make your team. These are just simply suggestions. So here are my thoughts. I'm not going to try to make this video too long because we got a lot of ground to cover with this Charlotte Hornets team. I'm going to start out by saying that I don't like the idea of them commingling the Charlotte Bobcats and the Charlotte Hornets on one team. It's not that I don't think that Bobcats are an important part of the history of that team and that franchise, but the caveat with that being said is the original Charlotte Hornets, we're talking the Larry Johnson and the Alonzo Mourning era here, Dell Curry. So the original Charlotte Hornets are actually the New Orleans Pelicans for their franchise. So there's actually duplication between those two rosters. And because of that reason, I decided to only make my all-time Charlotte Hornets team a team that just strictly was Charlotte Hornets. So there are no Charlotte Bobcats and there are no New Orleans Pelicans on my all-time Hornets team, okay? Some people may not like that idea because technically the Charlotte Bobcats took the name and the franchise, and I get that. But I'm trying to be a purist and look at the all-time Charlotte Hornets team. And it's hard for me to do that seeing Gerald Wallace in a Hornets uniform. So, with that said, I've made a lot of changes on this team. So, I made a lot of deletions off this team, and just bear with me, this video is going to be a little bit longer, but you'll see why I made the choices that I made. Alright, the first person that I dropped was Eddie Jones, the very first guy on the list, and the highest ranked player on the team. By the time I'm done with this video, he won't be the highest ranked player anymore. Well, Eddie Jones, if you look at his numbers, only was a Charlotte Hornet for a season and a half. I'm sorry, but that kind of doesn't fit the criteria of being one of the greatest players on that team if you only played there for a season and a half. So Eddie Jones, the first to go. These guys all stay. The next one to go is Jared Wallace. And I go back to Jared Wallace also being deleted. And Jared Wallace was a great player, but he wasn't a Charlotte Hornet. He was a Charlotte Bobcat. So, Jared Wallace goes. Kimble Walker, I left on the team because he's a Charlotte Hornet. He was both a Bobcat and a Hornet. Al Jefferson, same thing. Dell Curry, Muggsy Bogues, Kendall Gill, all stay. Baron Davis, I believe I left on the team. Derrick Coleman stays on the team. Steven Jackson. Again, Steve Jack was only a Bobcat, so he doesn't make this team. He's not a Hornet. And you can see he's even shown as a Bobcat in this photo. P.J. Brown. P.J. Brown, I dropped from the team. He was a Charlotte Hornet, as you can see from his jersey there. But I found alternatives, I guess you would say, for that position, and we'll get to that in a second. Raymond Felton, enough said. I mean, it's a Bobcat, and, I'm not trying to be mean, but I don't know if he belongs on any all-time team other than the Bobcats. I can't put him on the Charlotte Hornets. So, these are my changes. Stay with me while I load the updated roster. Alright, the first major addition to this roster, which, I don't understand why NBA 2K ignores this fact, is Chris Paul. Now stay with me on this, okay? Although Chris Paul, I don't think was a Charlotte Hornet, he was a New Orleans Hornet, which the New Orleans Hornets are now the New Orleans Pelicans. But that franchise was the Charlotte Hornets before they changed their name. So Chris Paul, even though he never donned the Charlotte outfit, he played for the New Orleans Hornets for many years, where he was originally drafted. And as you can see, he's an overall 96. So that, going back to Eddie Jones, That's the best player on the team right there, Chris Paul. How could you not have him on an all-time Hornets team? Simple as that. So no discussion, I guess, further than that. So the next person that I added to the list at power forward, and remember I mentioned, actually, it looks like I added, was he on the stock roster? I think Mashburn is on the stock roster, so I didn't add him. But the next person I added was David West, and the same deal as Chris Paul. He was a New Orleans Hornet, but I don't think he was a Charlotte Hornet. But David West is definitely an upgrade. Very underrated player, played very long time in the NBA. I think he just retired this past season. Maybe I'm wrong. But he won his championship with the Warriors and hung it up. But David West, a very dominating force at power forward for a long time in the NBA. Definitely an upgrade over P.J. Brown. Let's see. The next person, Kimble Walker. We talked about him. He's the true Charlotte Hornet now, but he's not better than Chris Paul. So Kemba's the backup. You got Dell Curry, Muggsy Bogues. This guy, often overlooked, and I believe this is one of the rare exceptions. Yes, he also was a New Orleans Hornet, but he also was a Charlotte Bobcat. And for whatever reason, they omitted him off of the team. Now, I think it's more important to have Tyson Chandler on the team than it ever would be Raymond Felton. So, adding Tyson Chandler to the team is definitely a good backup alternative to Alonzo Mourning over P.J. Brown again. This is the first created player. I couldn't get a real good customization of him. Maybe you can do a better job. But Kelly Tripucka. Kelly Tripucka played small forward for the Hornets. He was on the expansion team. He played out of the University of Notre Dame in the early 80s. Was drafted by the Pistons, if I'm not mistaken, and had some very formidable years with the Detroit Pistons. But when the expansion draft came, the Charlotte Hornets selected Kelly Tripucka, and he was kind of the face of the franchise for a couple years. So, very adequate small forward, very good scorer, good guy off the bench to give you some instant offense. Again, the image isn't the best. Maybe you can do a custom image a little better, but I feel anybody that's a Charlotte Hornets fan can probably agree you have to have Kelly Tripucka on your team. Kelly Tripucka is a Charlotte Hornet. You know, many of the people that remember the original franchise know who Kelly Tripucka is. Finally, the 13th man on the roster, we got Derrick Coleman as the backup power forward. Coleman was a very formidable player, but he only spent 3 seasons with Charlotte. So if your preference is P.J. Brown over Derrick Coleman, that might be where you make the swap. Baron Davis, we talked about him at point guard. We leave him on the team. He had some excellent seasons with the New Orleans Hornets again. And it looks like he played for the Charlotte Hornets. He was one of their picks originally, but as you can see, he played 5 seasons, 5.5 before he was traded to Golden State. 1 season, he averaged 22.9 a game. So, the only thing I might suggest is you put him above Muggsy Bogues. You know, Muggsy Bogues is a very talented athlete, but to say the least, he's not a real good scorer on the game. You know, Baron Davis is a better scoring option. You know, Muggsy can run the point, but he's not a real good scoring threat. Baron Davis is a better outside shooter, so you might want to swap those two out, you know, in your rotation. And finally, one that I felt needed to be added that was often overlooked is David Wesley. And David Wesley was a Charlotte and New Orleans Hornet as well. Very formidable shooting guard off the bench. You already have Dell Curry at shooting guard. I suppose if you didn't want Tripucka on your team, you could swap those two out. But if you're going to create Tripucka, you might as well have him on your roster and not sitting on the bench inactive. So, you know, these are the guys that I felt, you know, were probably the most important guys to have on the game that the stock roster does not. One person that I was on the fence about putting on there, and let's see if I can find him really quick here. was Peja Stojakovic. But after I looked at his numbers, he only played a couple seasons for New Orleans. And again, that goes back to the Eddie Jones and the Dan Marley, of the world. You got to kind of play more than a couple seasons for a team to be the all-time great. I mean, Sacramento King, no doubt about it. But New Orleans Hornets, it's kind of like, well, maybe, maybe not. But I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it's been a while since I put this roster together, that this is where I found David Wesley on the 07-08 team, and you could pull Chris Paul off of there. But this again is my opinion. I was debating on not even putting this team on there because of this whole confusion. The other thing that I thought about doing, and going back this way, I'm not trying to move too fast here, but you'll get my discussion point here in a second, was I thought about putting them all on the 92-93 roster as the true Charlotte Hornets and leaving the other Charlotte Hornets as the Bobcats. But then I thought, well, you're not really playing as the Bobcats, so I kind of went back and forth with that. This Charlotte Hornets at least has the right era jerseys for Alonzo Mourning, Muggsy Bogues, Kendall Gill, on down the list. Where I feel the new Charlotte Hornets jerseys don't really capture the old school jerseys like Muggsy's wearing there, or LJ. Let's see if we can like Alonzo Mourning's jersey there. I wish the option was that you could play with those, but they look cooler, I feel, with the 92-93 team than they do the all-time team. So, in closing, this is kind of a longer video. Let me go back to the all-time Hornets here. We have a coach, and that is Allan Bristow. And if you don't know who Allan Bristow was, he was a big man that played for about 7, 8, 9, 10 years in the late 70s, early 80s. Played for the Spurs, comes to mind. But Allan Bristow was probably the most successful coach of the Hornets. And that's overall. I mean, there's been other coaches that have taken them to the playoffs, etc. But Allan Bristow probably was the most successful. Again, it's up to your discretion of who you want to coach the team. You could put the current coach on there. It probably wouldn't make a difference. In the grand scheme of things, the Charlotte Hornets all-time team is probably one of the weakest ones on the all-time roster list, only because they haven't had really a winning franchise ever, and there's only been a few key guys. I mean, out of the list, Alonzo Mourning's the only Hall of Famer. I mean, I'm sure Chris Paul will be one someday, but Alonzo Mourning's the only Hall of Famer on the list. And when you're facing the all-time Lakers or Celtics, when the entire roster is basically Hall of Famers, the Charlotte Hornets aren't going to match up too good against them. So, in closing, I hope you agree with my thoughts on the Charlotte Hornets. Put some comments below. I can't put guys that were Bobcats in Charlotte Hornets uniforms. I wish NBA 2K would address this and make an all-time Bobcats team. And with the logos and whatever, that would be excellent. But tell me what you guys think. I know this video is a little longer than usual, but we will trim it down a little bit and make it a little short. So thanks for joining me, and join me again for another video. Thanks.